The Defense Dispatch.
This is the story of the night Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's career broke in half. She came with a binder. A big one. It was thick, leather-bound, and bristling with color-coded tabs. The kind of binder that screams, "I came prepared," the same way a peacock's tail screams, "I am worthy of your attention." She carried it onto the stage like a trial lawyer carries a briefcase, as if it held the evidence that would bury her opponent and vindicate every single thing she had ever said on any platform that had ever given her a microphone. And when J.D. Vance calmly, almost gently, the way you'd ask a friend to settle a bar tab, asked her to open that binder and name one single thing she had actually accomplished, she opened it. She flipped through it on live television in a silent room in Youngstown, Ohio. For 15 seconds that felt like 15 years, she found nothing. Or rather, she found exactly what was in there. Talking points, proposals, resolutions, frameworks, aspirational language, and discovered, in the worst possible moment, that none of it was an answer. A resolution isn't a law, Vance said. It's a wish. Try again. She did not try again. But that moment, the binder moment, as the internet would cruelly and permanently name it, did not come out of nowhere. It was the final act of an evening that had been, from the very beginning, a slow, methodical, and almost elegant dismantling. And to truly appreciate just how thoroughly things fell apart for the Congresswoman from New York's 14th District, you have to start at the beginning, when she walked into that auditorium with her film crew, her binder, and her absolute certainty. And the audience still thought they were going to see a debate. The town hall was held in Youngstown, Ohio, in an auditorium that used to host union rallies back when there were enough union members to fill it. The seats were the old kind, wooden, creaky, and bolted to a floor that remembered decades of steel-toed boots. The local PBS affiliate had organized the event under a title so bland it practically begged to be ignored. The Future of the American Working Class, a Bipartisan Conversation. It was supposed to be a civilized, policy-focused exchange between Vice President J.D. Vance and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, moderated by a veteran journalist named Helen Marsh, who had covered enough political bloodbaths to know this would not stay civilized for long. The audience was 800 strong. No stacking, no pre-screening, just people from the Mahoning Valley and surrounding counties who showed up early enough to get a seat. You had factory workers, nurses, diner owners, retirees living on fixed incomes, and a cluster of college students from Youngstown State who had arrived in matching green T-shirts and immediately regretted sitting next to a row of retired steelworkers who looked at them like they were from another planet. AOC entered first. She walked in with the practiced energy of someone who had worked 1,000 rooms. Shoulders back, chin up, a wave that managed to look both spontaneous and choreographed at the same time. Her team trailed behind her, a communications director already thumbing a phone, and a videographer capturing behind-the-scenes content for what would later become the most regrettable Instagram story of the year. She carried that thick binder under one arm. She smiled at the college section. They cheered. The rest of the room offered polite, measured applause, the kind you give at a funeral when someone says something nice about the deceased, but you're not sure you agree. Vance came in through a side door. No entourage, no binder. He shook hands with a man in the front row, a retired pipe fitter named Gerald, who later told a reporter he hadn't voted in 12 years, but came tonight because the vice president grew up 20 minutes from my house, and I wanted to see if he still remembered. Vance remembered. He asked about Gerald's knee surgery. Gerald looked stunned that he knew. Helen Marsh called the room to order, laid out the format, opening statements, audience questions, a direct exchange, and the evening began. AOC opened strong. She always opened strong. She spoke about the hollowing out of the American middle class with the kind of controlled fury that had made her a star. She talked about the corporate greed, the tax loopholes, the politicians who visit places like Youngstown every 4 years and then forget they exist. She gestured toward the shuttered mills visible through the auditorium's high windows. She invoked the Green New Deal as a lifeline for communities exactly like this one. And then she turned to Vance with a line that landed like a jab. "My colleague across the stage wrote a best-selling book about the pain of places like this," she said, and then spent his career making sure nothing changed. He turned suffering into a brand. And the people in this room are still suffering. The college section erupted. A few fists pumped in the air. AOC allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. From the fourth row, a low, gravelly voice, not a shout, but one that carried, cut right through the applause. An old man, 70, if he was a day, in a faded steel workers' local 1462 cap, spoke just loud enough for the nearest mic to pick up. "She's never set foot here before tonight." A ripple went through the room. It wasn't laughter, and it wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous. Recognition. AOC heard it. Her eyes darted toward the voice for just a split second, then snapped back to the camera. She smiled, but her rhythm was broken. Historians would later note that the first crack appeared before the debate had even really started, and it hadn't come from Vance. It came from the room itself. Vance stood up. He didn't try to match her energy. He spoke quietly. So quietly, in fact, that people in the back had to lean in to hear him, which was, of course, the entire point. "I'm not going to give a speech," he said. "I grew up about 20 minutes from here. My grandmother raised me in a house that always smelled like cigarettes, Vicks VapoRub, and whatever she happened to be frying. I don't need to explain this place to you. You are this place." He paused. "I didn't come here tonight to talk about myself. I came because the folks in this room deserve to hear the truth about what's actually been done in their name, and what hasn't. And I think, by the end of tonight, we'll all have a much clearer picture of who's been fighting for you, and who's just been performing for the cameras." It landed softly, maybe even a little too softly. But there was something else underneath it all. A weight, a direction, a promise that the evening was headed somewhere, and he already knew the way. Helen Marsh glanced down at her notes. The audience settled in. Both fighters were now in the ring. One had come to put on a show. The other had come to prosecute. The first question from the audience was from a woman named Diane, a laid-off auto parts worker whose hands told a story that her words didn't need to. She stood up at the floor mic and asked the simplest, most gut-wrenching question a politician can ever face. "What have either of you actually done for people like me?" AOC smoothly pivoted to her legislative record. She listed co-sponsored bills, a Clean Energy Transition Act, a federal jobs guarantee proposal, and a workers' rights resolution. She spoke with a level of detail that screamed preparation, rattling off bill numbers and committee assignments with the ease of someone who'd rehearsed this very moment. Vance just listened. He jotted something down on a notepad. When it was his turn, he didn't attack her record. Instead, he just looked at Diane. "Did any of that help you personally?" Diane shook her head. "No, sir." "Did it help anyone you know?" "Not that I've heard of." The room grew very quiet. AOC jumped back in, saying, "Systemic change takes time. Structural reforms don't create results overnight." The Republican obstruction machine blocks progressive legislation before it can even take effect. Vance nodded, almost looking sympathetic. "It's been 6 years," he said. "At what point does systemic change takes time just become another way of saying, I don't have results?" Diane sat down. She didn't look at AOC. The second question came from a college student in a green t-shirt, which should have been friendly territory for AOC. He asked about climate policy, and she launched into the answer she was born to give. The passion was genuine. The statistics were perfectly polished. You could feel the moral urgency in the air. She painted a vivid picture of coastal flooding, crop failures, climate refugees, and a generation inheriting a planet on fire. The student section erupted in applause with the kind of passion you see from people who've just found their champion. Vance didn't argue with the science. He didn't deny climate change. He did something much more effective. He asked her a math question. "You've called for eliminating fossil fuel jobs in multiple public statements. There are 800 people in this room. I'd be willing to bet at least 200 of them work in industries your Green New Deal would either get rid of or completely overhaul. Can you tell me, right now, to their faces, how many of them would lose their current job under your plan?" AOC deflected, mentioning transition jobs, federal retraining programs, and clean energy employment projections that showed net job growth by 2035. Vance let her finish. "That's a beautiful brochure answer, but I asked for a number. How many people in this room would lose their job?" "You don't know, do you?" She started to answer. "And here's a follow-up. How many of those retraining programs have you personally visited?" Silence. "I've reviewed the data extensively." "So that's a no?" From the working class rows a sound arose, not quite laughter, but something close to it. It was a dry, knowing exhale that rippled through the seats like a breeze moving through tall grass. 3 or 4 people shook their heads. A woman crossed her arms. The college section was quieter now. Not hostile, just uncertain. The way an audience gets when the person they came to cheer for has stumbled, and they're not sure if she can get back up. AOC regrouped. She was far too seasoned to let one single exchange define the whole night, and she knew exactly where Vance was weak. So, she went on the attack. "Let's talk about contradictions, Mr. Vice President. You wrote a best-selling book all about poverty in Appalachia. You positioned yourself as the voice of the forgotten working class. And what did you do right after that? You went off to Yale Law School. You became a venture capitalist. You started investing in Silicon Valley tech companies. And then you ran for Senate, backed by money from Peter Thiel. You wrote a book about being poor, and then you turned into everything your book warned people about. That isn't a rags-to-riches story. That is a betrayal. Gift wrapped in a book deal." The line was razor-sharp. Her delivery was flawless. Even the steelworkers section let out a reluctant murmur of appreciation, not for her politics, but for the sheer skill of it. It was the sort of moment that would have completely taken over the news cycle after any other debate. Vance took the hit. He just nodded. He even cracked a smile. It wasn't a politician's smile, but the tired half-grin of a man who'd heard this exact attack 1,000 times and made his peace with it long ago. "I'm not going to apologize for going to law school or for building businesses. I put my money into companies that created jobs right here in Ohio, not New York, not California, in Ohio. Would you like me to list them for you?" He didn't even wait for her to answer. "But since you brought up the subject of contradictions, let's agree on one thing. Let's agree that you measure a person's credibility by seeing if their actions actually match their words. That's fair, right? Good. I'm going to hold you to that. And with that, he moved on. He turned to Helen Marsh for the next question. And as the moderator called on another person in the audience, a historian might note what the cameras couldn't quite capture. The look on AOC's face right after Vance said, "I'm going to hold you to that." It wasn't exactly fear. It was the look of someone who'd just heard a door lock behind them and wasn't yet sure which side of it they were on. For anyone paying attention, the pattern was starting to become clear. AOC was fighting in the moment. She was reactive, emotional, and sharp, perfect for the highlight reels. Vance, on the other hand, was fighting across time. Every question, every answer, every apparent concession was just another brick in a structure no one else could see yet. You could say she was winning the individual rounds, but he was building a case. It all started with Amazon. Vance didn't just jump right into it. He waited for a question about economic development to come up. It was a softball from a small business owner asking what could be done to bring more employers to the area. AOC gave her answer, and it was perfectly fine. It was the standard stuff: community investment, public-private partnerships, incentivizing green industries. Then it was Vance's turn. "I agree with a lot of what the Congresswoman said about attracting employers. I really do. The disagreement we have isn't about if we want the jobs. It's about whether we're actually willing to take them when they finally show up." He let that line hang in the air for 2 full seconds. Back in 2019, Amazon announced it was going to build its second headquarters in Long Island City, right in the Congresswoman's home state of New York. That meant 25,000 jobs. The average salary was going to be $150,000. And we're not talking about executive positions. These were jobs for project managers, administrative staff, logistics coordinators, maintenance crews, cafeteria workers. Real working people, the very kind of people both of us claim to fight for. He then turned to face AOC. The city had negotiated a deal for $3 billion in tax incentives spread out over 25 years. In exchange, Amazon was projected to generate around $27 billion in tax revenue. That's a 9-to-1 return on investment. Any business owner in this room would have taken that deal in a heartbeat. But the Congresswoman, she didn't take that deal. In fact, she celebrated when Amazon pulled out. She even posted about it on social media. I think the exact word she used was victory. She stood right in front of the cameras and declared that the people of Queens had won. Here Vance paused. When he started talking again, his voice was noticeably lower. "I've spoken with some of those people. Not on camera, and not for some press release. I just talked with them. There was a man named Miguel who ran a little restaurant just 2 blocks from where the headquarters was supposed to be built. He had just signed a 5-year lease expansion because he was banking on that headquarters coming. When Amazon pulled the plug, he couldn't keep up with the overhead. He had to close down within 8 months. There was a woman named Patricia, a single mom who worked in commercial cleaning. She'd been told there were going to be hundreds of new cleaning and maintenance jobs at that campus. She is still waiting." Then he looked straight at AOC. "You were celebrating on Twitter the very day their futures fell apart. You called it a victory for the people. I'd just like to know which people you were talking about, because it certainly wasn't Miguel, and it wasn't Patricia." The room wasn't silent. Instead, it felt pressurized. The college kids were suddenly very interested in their shoes. A man in the 5th row, union jacket, thick arms, nodded slowly, the way you do when you've known something for a long time, and are finally hearing it confirmed out loud by someone who matters. AOC fired right back. Her voice was tight, controlled, and urgent. That deal was nothing but corporate welfare. $3 billion of taxpayer money was being handed over to the richest company on the planet, which is run by the richest man on the planet. New York's residents weren't looking for a handout from Jeff Bezos. What they really needed was real investment in their own neighborhoods, not some special deal that would skyrocket rents and push out the people who'd lived there for years. $27 billion in tax revenue, Vance said, his voice low. You said no to $27 billion just because fighting it looked good on your Instagram feed. That number just hung there in the air, like a final judgment. And you know what? The rents went up anyway. Queens still gentrified, but without any of the jobs. You got all the people pushed out, with none of the paychecks. That isn't a win. That's literally the worst of both worlds. Then Vance turned away from the podium, posing a question to the audience that wasn't really a question at all. He faced the crowd directly. Raise your hand if you would take a corporate-sponsored job that pays $150,000 a year. Hands started going up. It wasn't all at once. It started in the front rows, moved to the middle, and then rolled to the back, just like a wave. You saw the hands of steelworkers, nurses, retirees, and small business owners, and even a few college students who looked a little sheepish, as if they were betraying a cause they hadn't quite thought all the way through. Now, I'm not even going to try and count all the hands, because giving you an exact number would take away from the power of the image. Let's just say that almost every single hand in that room was raised, and AOC stood there and watched it happen. She had just argued against a deal that every single person in this room would have been begging to get. And now, they knew it. And what was worse, she now knew that they knew. Vance didn't gloat, though. He simply said, "Let's move on." And that self-control was more crushing than any follow-up attack could have ever been. But he didn't actually move on. Not really. He decided to dig even deeper. Since we all agreed a little earlier that you measure credibility by whether someone's actions actually match their words, I want to bring up something that happened back in September of 2021. The Congresswoman went to the Met Gala. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, that's a huge annual fashion event in New York where tickets cost $35,000 each, and the guest list basically reads like a who's who from Forbes magazine. The Congresswoman showed up in a white dress with the words "Tax the Rich" painted right across the back. And you have to admit, it was a brilliant piece of political theater. He said the next few words with a tone that almost sounded like he was impressed. That image went absolutely everywhere. It became iconic. It was the exact kind of moment that builds a personal brand. And the Congresswoman is very, very good at building her brand. But then his tone shifted. But here's the part the brand didn't want you to see. The dress was from a designer named Aurora James, whose company, at that very time, owed a whole lot of money in back taxes to the IRS. This was a company that had been hit with tax liens in several different states. It was a company where former employees were claiming in public news reports that they weren't getting paid on time, or even getting their full paychecks. He let that sink in for a moment. So, the message on the dress was, "Tax the rich." But the designer who made that very dress wasn't paying her own taxes. And the workers who actually sewed the dress, according to the allegations, weren't even getting paid. You just can't write satire that's that perfect. And then there was laughter. Real, genuine laughter erupted from the rows of working-class people. It wasn't a cruel kind of laughter. It was the laughter of recognition. The kind of laugh that just comes out when someone finally says out loud what you've been thinking to yourself for years. AOC's voice sliced through the noise, sharp and defensive. That is a complete mischaracterization. Aurora James is a black woman entrepreneur who, I'm not questioning her race or her gender. I'm questioning her payroll. There's a difference. The laughter died instantly, and the silence that followed felt even heavier. Vance kept going. After the gala, a woman, one of the seamstresses who worked on that dress, tried to contact the Congresswoman's office. She explained that she hadn't been paid in full for the work she did on the gown. She sent an email to the office's public contact address, then sent a follow-up, and then a third one after that. He paused. She never got a response. Not a single one. The woman who wore a dress that said, "Tax the rich," couldn't even be bothered to reply to the woman who actually sewed it. I have the emails right here. He then placed a thin manila folder on the podium. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. Just the fact that it was sitting there was enough. And the way AOC's eyes were just locked on it, the way her whole body tensed up, the way her hands gripped the sides of her own podium, that told the room everything they needed to know about what might be inside. "That's a smear," AOC said. "You're just building a narrative. I'm just reading your own story back to you. If it sounds like a smear, maybe the story itself is the problem." Vance then shifted gears. His voice turned almost gentle, which was somehow even more devastating than if he'd been angry. "I want to say something that might actually surprise you. I genuinely admire the Congresswoman's story. A bartender from the Bronx runs a grassroots campaign and unseats an incumbent who's been in office for 10 terms. That takes guts. That takes conviction. That is the American dream. And I truly mean that." You could feel the audience soften a bit. Even AOC seemed, just for a moment, disarmed. But somewhere along the way, he said, the mission changed. The bartender who was supposed to be a voice for the working class started driving a Tesla, all while publicly attacking the man who builds them. The champion of public housing moved into a fancy apartment in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in D.C. The voice of the people started showing up to 35 those me galas dressed in custom designer gowns. He turned to her. "About 40 minutes ago, you stood at that podium and told this room that my success was a contradiction. That going from poverty to Yale to venture capital made me a hypocrite. You said those exact words. So let's apply that same standard. If my trajectory from poverty to success is a betrayal, what do you call yours?" The room held its breath. AOC opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I never said people can't be successful." "No, you said I was a contradiction. Those were your words 40 minutes ago, in this room, to these people." The murmur that rolled through the audience wasn't polite. It wasn't restrained. It was the sound of 800 people all reaching the same conclusion at the exact same time. And that conclusion did not look good for the woman standing at the left podium. The moderator, Helen Marsh, sensing the shift, called for a short intermission. Vance shook his head. "We don't need a break. We need to finish this." Helen glanced at AOC, whose expression screamed that she desperately wanted that break. Then, Helen looked out at the audience, who were already leaning forward in their seats with the body language of people who had absolutely no intention of going anywhere. "We'll continue," Helen said. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become the most replayed clip of political television that year, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. AOC, feeling the emotional ground crumble beneath her, pulled the only move she had left in her arsenal: the policy pivot. She dragged the debate back to legislation, to specific bills, to specific committee votes. She spoke quickly, with the precision of someone trying to build a fortress out of facts before the next tidal wave could hit. She cited the Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act, a bill she'd co-authored that sent federal funding for renewable energy projects to underserved communities. She cited the Workers' First Agenda, a package of labor protections she had championed. She listed off vote counts, committee hearings, and bipartisan outreach efforts that had been shot down by Republican leadership. By any objective measure, it was a solid legislative defense. On a different night, against a different opponent, it might have actually worked. Vance listened to every single word. Then he pulled out a single sheet of paper. I appreciate the Congresswoman's legislative passion. Let me just read back what she cited. The Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act, $4 billion for climate research and $200 million for job retraining. $4 billion for research, $200 million for the people in this room. You're telling working Americans that their jobs are worth 5 cents for every dollar you spend. He set the paper down. The Workers' First Agenda, introduced in committee, never even made it to a floor vote. The bipartisan outreach. I checked. The only Republican co-sponsor pulled out after the Congresswoman publicly called him a fossil fuel puppet on social media 2 weeks later. That's not outreach. That's sabotage. AOC's jaw tightened. She started to answer, but Vance was already moving on to the next attack. There was a congressman, a Democrat, not a Republican, named David Hernandez, from a swing district in Pennsylvania. He asked the Congresswoman's caucus to support a bipartisan infrastructure bill that would have brought a manufacturing plant to his district. 1,200 jobs. The bill included a provision for a natural gas processing component, not a drilling operation, a processing facility for gas that was already being extracted. He paused. The Congresswoman's faction killed it. A purity test. David Hernandez lost his seat the following November by 3 points. Those 1,200 jobs never appeared. And the people in his district, the ones who were counting on those jobs, they didn't get retraining. They didn't get transition assistance. They got nothing. From the back of the auditorium, a man's voice, ragged with what sounded like years of built-up frustration, yelled out, "That's right!" The dam was breaking. "You talk about solidarity," Vance said, his voice now steady, almost sad. "But your solidarity has a purity test. And the people who fail it aren't billionaires or lobbyists. They're working people in swing districts who needed a factory more than they needed your approval." AOC was rattled. Now anyone could see it. Her gestures grew sharper. Her voice pitched higher. And then she made the mistake that would end up defining her career. She turned away from the audience. She turned away from Vance. She looked directly into the nearest camera. Not at the people in the room, but into the lens, at the audience at home, at the algorithm. And she delivered a monologue clearly designed not for Youngstown, Ohio, but for Twitter, for Instagram, for the clip that would go viral before the town hall was even over. This is what they do. This is the playbook. They take a woman of color who dares to challenge power, who dares to speak truth to a system built on exploitation, and they try to tear her down, piece by piece. They cherry-pick facts. They manufacture scandals. They parade sob stories designed to distract from the real issue, which is the billionaire class versus a congresswoman. Vance's voice was calm, almost kind, and that very kindness was the sharpest blade of the night. I'm not tearing you down because of your race or your gender. I'm simply reading you your own record. If your record is what's tearing you down, that's not my fault. The audience erupted. not the college section. They sat frozen, some with mouths open, some staring at the floor. The eruption came from everywhere else. The steelworkers, the nurses, the retirees, the small business owners. Even Diane, the auto parts worker who had asked the first question of the night, was on her feet. But the standing ovation stopped the moment another voice rose above it. A woman in the 7th row stood up. She was a black woman in her mid-50s, wearing hospital scrubs under an unzipped jacket. Her name tag read, Brenda. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The room quieted for her, the way a room quiets for someone whose authority comes not from a title, but from a life lived. I have something to say. Helen Marsh gestured for her to approach the floor microphone. She did, with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had spent 30 years walking hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for 29 years. I'm also a black woman, and I need to say this directly. She looked right at AOC. Don't use my skin color as your shield. I didn't come here tonight to watch you play the race card when you can't answer a question. I came here to find out who's going to help my patients keep their insurance and my neighbors keep their jobs. Answer the question. The sound that followed was not applause. It was something more primal, a collective exhale, the release of a pressure that had been building all evening. Some people stood, some clapped, some simply nodded over and over again. It was the way people nod when a truth they've been carrying alone is finally spoken aloud by someone else. AOC stood at her podium, her team visible in the wings, their phones no longer recording, exchanging the kind of glances that only people in a crisis do. The videographer had lowered his camera. The communications director had stopped typing. There are blows you can recover from, and then there are blows that rewrite the story. This was the second kind, because the most devastating indictment of the evening had not come from J.D. Vance. It had come from the very community AOC claimed to represent, and for that, there is no political playbook. Helen Marsh, sensing that the evening had reached a point of no return, tried to steer toward closing statements. But Vance had one more question, and it was the question the entire evening had been building toward. Congresswoman, you've been carrying that binder all night. You brought it to the podium. You've referenced it several times. I'd like you to open it. AOC's hand went to the binder, instinctively, protectively. Open it and read me one specific accomplishment from your time in office. One bill that passed into law. One factory that opened because of your direct action. One job, just one, that exists today because of something you did. Not a resolution, not a co-sponsorship, not a committee hearing. A result. And the room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the airless silence of a room that has collectively stopped breathing. AOC opened the binder. She turned a page, then another, then another. The sound of crisp paper, loud in the microphone, filled the auditorium the way a ticking clock fills a room at midnight. She stopped on a page and read it silently. Her lips moved, then stopped. Her answer about the resolution on the Green New Deal framework, establishing a national conversation, was met with his retort. A resolution isn't a law, it's a wish. Try again. More pages turned. The rustling was louder now, or maybe the silence around it was just deeper. In the 4th row, Gerald, the retired pipe fitter who had shaken Vance's hand at the entrance, lowered his head and rubbed his eyes, not in grief, but in the exhausted recognition of something he had always suspected. 10 seconds passed. In a room of 800 people on live television, 10 seconds is an epoch. 15 seconds is a geological age. AOC closed the binder. She did not try again. The live microphone caught the sound of her swallowing. It caught the slight tremor in her breathing. And across America, on every screen and speaker carrying the broadcast, the audience heard what Youngstown heard. The sound of someone who had built a career on words discovering, in the worst possible moment, that she had just run out of them. Vance said nothing. He didn't need to. That thick, impressive binder she'd been carrying all evening, her prop, her shield, her symbol of being prepared, was actually just full of talking points, not results. And everyone there knew the difference. Helen Marsh officially ended the town hall at 9:47 p.m. Her voice sounded steady and professional, but people who knew her later said her hands were shaking. Not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of overseeing an event that had turned from politics into a public takedown. The fallout started right away. Or more accurately, it kicked off in two separate places at once. Inside the room, and across the digital world that was watching online. In the room, AOC's team quickly formed a protective circle around her. Her chief of staff was suddenly at her elbow, whispering urgently in her ear. The videographer had already packed up his camera. The recording had stopped. AOC skipped the traditional handshake across the stage after the event. She just walked quickly, head down, clutching that binder to her chest as she headed for the backstage exit. A local news reporter shouted a question at her. She didn't even turn around. Backstage, I can only tell you what was seen from a distance. There was a small group of staffers in a hallway, their phones buzzing like an angry beehive that just got kicked. And right in the middle of them was the Congresswoman, completely silent. Her chief of staff's phone was ringing off the hook. She wasn't answering. Someone handed AOC a water bottle. She just held it, not taking a sip. The very machine that had turned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into a political powerhouse. The same machine that always knew exactly what to post, what clip to share, how to spin it, was, for the very first time, completely stumped on what to do next. Meanwhile, Vance hadn't moved from the stage. He simply stepped down from the podium and walked right into the crowd. For the next 40 minutes, as cameras were being packed away and the lights went down one by one, he stood in the aisles talking with anyone who approached him. He talked with Gerald about the pipe fitter's pension plan. He talked to Diane about job retraining programs at the community college. He listened to a young woman who'd driven all the way from Akron because, as she said, she needed to see if any of these politicians were the real deal. He asked her what she meant by real. She replied, someone who's actually listening, not just waiting for their turn to speak. Brenda, the nurse from the 7th row, was the last one to talk to him. She shook his hand and said plainly, I voted for her last time. I won't be making that mistake again. Vance didn't gloat. He wasn't campaigning. He just nodded and said, tell me what you need. I'm listening. And so she did. For 6 straight minutes, on that dimming stage in the nearly empty auditorium, a nurse told the vice president all about a hospital system on the verge of collapse and a community that couldn't afford to wait for some big systemic change. He wrote it all down on a piece of paper with a pen. The internet, of course, was doing what the internet does best. AOC's comms team, running on pure instinct and muscle memory, clipped the woman of color challenging power part and blasted it across all social media within 30 minutes of the event ending. The clip was framed very carefully, showing her defiant words without any of the context of what came before or after. For about 12 minutes, it worked exactly like they'd planned. It got shares, retweets, fire emojis, and hashtags of solidarity. But then, the full, unedited exchange dropped. Someone in the audience, who was never identified or credited, had recorded the whole thing on their phone. It showed AOC's turn to the camera. It had Vance's response, The crowd's reaction, Brenda stepping in, the binder moment, the awkward silence, all of it totally unedited. It was 4 minutes and 37 seconds that completely destroyed their carefully crafted clip. It was like watching a controlled demolition take down a building, not piece by piece, but all at once, floor by floor, until nothing was left. Within just 2 hours, that full clip had 11 million views. By midnight, it was the #1 trending topic on every single platform that still has them. And by morning, it had earned a name. The Internet, with its unique talent for brutal humor, called it the binder moment, and the name stuck like a permanent tattoo on pop culture. Next came the parodies. A TikToker filmed himself just flipping through an empty notebook while his friend asked, "So, what have you actually accomplished?" That video got 4 million views in a single day. A late-night host held up a binder on his show and said, "AOC brought a binder to a fact fight." He joked, "That's like bringing a resume to a job you've already been fired from." A remix artist, the kind that the Internet seems to churn out like a factory, took those 15 seconds of silence, looped the sound of the page turning, and set it all to a lo-fi beat. The track was somehow both a devastating takedown and weirdly easy to listen to. It actually charted on Spotify's viral playlist. The title of the song was "Turning Pages, No Results Found." AOC went completely silent online for 3 days. When she finally recorded a long Instagram video from her apartment, lit like a confessional, her tone was defiant, but the energy had shifted. She talked about systemic attacks targeting progressive women, the manufactured drama of political theater, and her refusal to be defined by just one night. It was skillfully put together, and it was delivered with poise. In any other situation, it would have completely reset the narrative. But these weren't normal circumstances. The comments section, usually a fortress of unconditional support moderated with military precision, was now fractured. Tucked between the heart emojis and "We stand with you" messages, a new type of comment began to appear, first as a trickle, and then as a steady current. Just answer the question. What have you actually accomplished? Open the binder. The moderators deleted them, but they returned even faster. The algorithm, after years of pushing her content to friendly audiences, had detected a shift in engagement and was now, with the cold efficiency of software, amplifying the dissent. The political fallout unfolded over the next week with the slow, grinding certainty of a landslide. A poll released just 4 days after the town hall showed her approval with independent voters had plummeted by 11 points. Among Latino voters under 40, once her most solid base, the drop was 7 points. And among union households, a group she never dominated but always competed for, she was now underwater by 19 points. 2 moderate Democrats, one from Virginia and another from Michigan, were asked on the Sunday morning shows if they still considered AOC an asset to the party. Both gave answers lasting less than 10 seconds, and both included the phrase, "The party is bigger than any one individual." In Washington, that sentence is a eulogy, delivered while the patient is still breathing. 5 days after the town hall, a member of the squad, her closest political ally, someone she had championed, fundraised for, and stood beside at countless press conferences, appeared on a cable news panel. When the host brought up the Youngstown exchange, the ally paused, tilted her head, and said, "I think there are important lessons for all of us about connecting with working-class voters." She then immediately changed the subject to healthcare. As the narrator would observe, in politics, changing the subject is the quietest and most irreversible form of betrayal. 2 major donors, a tech entrepreneur and a media executive, quietly redirected their contributions away from AOC-aligned PACs. There were no public statements, no dramatic announcements, just the silent movement of money, which is the only sound that truly matters in American politics. The moderate Democrat she had once publicly called a corporate puppet with no backbone also resurfaced. The congressman from Ohio, of all places, posted 4 words to social media the morning the new poll numbers dropped: "Chickens come home." He didn't need to say anything more. The internet, already fluent in the language of political ruin, understood perfectly. But the deepest wound was the one that hadn't even fully opened yet. 2 weeks after the town hall, a reporter from a major national outlet, the kind who spends months on a single story and whose phone calls make press secretaries lose sleep, published the first part of a 3-part investigation into the finances of AOC's campaign. These questions weren't new. They had been asked before by smaller outlets and less credible voices, only to be dismissed, ignored, or buried under the weight of her media armor. The questions were about irregularities in how campaign funds were routed through affiliated PACs, discrepancies in expense reports that were technically legal but looked catastrophic, and a pattern of payments to political consultants who also happened to be personal friends. None of it was proven, and none of it had led to a formal investigation. But that was exactly the point. Before Youngstown, these questions were simply unaskable, not because they were unimportant, but because the professional cost of asking them was just too high. She was too popular, too media-savvy, and too skilled at turning any inquiry into a story of persecution. That armor had held strong for years. The town hall didn't create the questions, it just removed the armor. And once that armor was gone, the questions that had been waiting in the dark for years finally had permission to step into the light. The narrator of this story doesn't know how those questions will be answered. That is a story for another night. What can be said is this: the investigation would not have been published 2 weeks earlier. The editor who greenlit it said as much to a colleague in private before Youngstown. He reportedly said that touching her was a career risk. After Youngstown, not touching her was a journalistic failure. J.D. Vance flew back to Washington the morning after the town hall. But before leaving Youngstown, he stopped at a diner on Market Street, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that tasted like it was brewed years ago. He took a seat at the counter. He ordered a black coffee and toast. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a name tag that read Carol, recognized him. She said she'd watched the town hall on her phone during her break. "What did you think?" he asked. She refilled his coffee without being asked. "I think you told the truth." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He left a 20 on the counter for a $4 tab, not because he was performing generosity for an audience, but because Carol's Diner was the kind of place that remembered, and he was the kind of man who wanted to be remembered correctly. He flew back to Washington. AOC didn't return to the Capitol for 3 days. When she did, the corridors that had once parted for her, with staffers who wanted to be seen nearby, colleagues who angled for joint press conferences, and reporters who competed for her quotes, were just corridors. The staffers just looked at their phones. The colleagues found reasons to be somewhere else. The reporters still called, but their questions had changed. They were no longer asking what she thought about the day's issues. They were asking her to respond to the investigation. They were asking about the binder. They were asking her the same question Vance had asked, the question Brenda had demanded, the question that 800 people in a creaky Ohio auditorium had watched her fail to answer. What have you actually accomplished? The town hall in Youngstown had lasted 90 minutes. What it started, however, would last much, much longer. And somewhere in the digital ether, on a lo-fi playlist that had no business being so popular, the sound of pages turning played on an infinite loop. A 15-second monument to the night. A binder full of talking points had met a room full of people who had stopped believing in words and started demanding results.